The learned educators on our panel this afternoon include Islamic scholar Sheikh Abdul Nawee, scholar and activist Sister Niciah Mujahid, public health professional and spoken word artist Sister Bayadir Mohamed-Osman. I'd like to share brief bios of our esteemed speakers. Please note that these are merely abridged versions of their very seasoned backgrounds and qualifications. Sheikh Abdul Jalil is a renowned scholar and resident alim of the Idara Jafriya Islamic Center in Burtonsville, Maryland. He began his Islamic studies journey at Al-Hidayah Islamic School and later started his Hausa studies at the Ahlul Bayt Institute in Accra, Ghana. He has served as a teacher at both institutions and has worked as one of the imams and speakers at the Shia Central Mosque in Accra. After years of service in Ghana, he moved to Iran to further his Hausa studies. After completing his Hausa studies there, he moved to the Washington, D.C. area and served different centers and mosques across the U.S. In addition to this, he also served our community by teaching Islamic studies and Quran at the Muslim Community School in Maryland. Thank you so much, Sheikh Jalil, for giving us your time and sharing your wisdom this afternoon. Inshallah, he's needed. Next, we have Sister Niciah Mujahid. She also graciously served as an educator in part 1 of our teaching series. Thank you so much for returning. She is an award-winning activist, scholar, writer, and educator, and a devoted wife and mother. She graduated from Howard University School of Divinity with a master's in social justice and ethics and minor in Islamic studies and Black church studies. There, she won the university-wide research competition, her work focusing on the central role of educating in Islam's prophetic ministry model. She also led the efforts to establish the Divinity School's first Joma services in 2018 and spent a year doing prison ministry work at the DC Department of Corrections. Sister Niciah is a revert to Islam, and much of her work spans the Black religious experience in America broadly. Her undergraduate work in African Studies and Restorative Justice at the University of Notre Dame lend themselves fully to her praxis in both her academic and ministry spaces. She offers a lens that allows us to view the Black experience, Islam, social justice, prophetic ministry, and spiritual wellness spiritual wellness intersectionality. MashaAllah. We are so very glad to have her return to teach us this afternoon. Finally, we have Sister Bayadir. She is a Sudanese-American public health professional and poet based in Maryland. As a spoken word artist, she has competed at the College Union's Poetry Slam Invitational, CUPSI, along with American University's Speak Fresh. Racking in over 1 million views, Bayadir's moving messages have been featured on Now This, and now she has even won several poetry competitions in the DMV area. She has performed in Philly, Denver, Dallas, and Los Angeles, to name a few cities. Her poetry examines her intersectional identity as a Black Muslim Sudanese woman. She uses her platform and voice to advocate for marginalized communities and her home country, Sudan. Her debut book, Secondhand Smoke, was recently published this year, mashallah. You can purchase a copy of her poetry book on her website, yourbayadir.com. We'll be sure to include her information on our social media pages as well, so please keep an eye out for that. Sister Bayadir, Sister Niciah, and Sheikh Jalil, we're really so honored to have you share your wisdom and expertise with us this afternoon. So again, thank you so much. To give you a little background about how today's event will occur, our speakers will begin by offering a presentation or lecture or poem about the topic at hand, and then this will be followed by a Q&A discussion. Accordingly, please feel free to put in any questions that you may have for the speakers in the chat box, and we will have our Q&A session moderator, Riza Baghai, who, like the rest of us, is here to learn, but he's also kindly taken the responsibility of reading your questions to the speakers and maybe even asking the questions you may be too embarrassed to ask yourself. I'd like to note that if you don't really feel comfortable sharing your questions in the public chat, you can send one directly and we can ask the question for you anonymously. And to kick off this event, inshallah, I'm done talking, thank you. We will begin with a brief Quran recitation by Brother Ali Reza Salimi. So the floor is yours, Brother Ali Reza.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم وأما من خاف مقام ربه ونهى النفس عن الهوى فإن الجنة هي المأوى يسألونك عن الساعة أيان مرساها وأما من خاف مقام ربه ونهى النفس عن الهوى فإن الجنة هي المأوى يسألونك عن الساعة أيان مرساها فيما أنت من ذكراها إلى ربك منتهاها إنما أنت منذر من يخشاها كأنهم يوم يرونها لم يلبثوا إلا عشية أو ضحاها صدق الله العلي العظيم. In the name of Allah, the most beneficent, the most merciful. And as for him who fears to stand in the presence of his Lord and forbids the soul from low desires, then surely the garden, that is the abode. They ask you about the hour when it will come. About what? You are one to remind of it. To your Lord is the goal of it. You are only a warner to him who would fear it. On the day that they see, it will be as though they had not tarried, but the latter part of a day or the early part of it. Sadaqallahu al-Azim.
MashaAllah. Thank you so much, Ali Reza, for that beautiful recitation. May Allah bless you for gracing us with that beautiful recitation. We appreciate it so much. Next up, I'd like to invite the accomplished poet, Sister Bayadir, to perform her spoken word piece entitled An Open Letter to Implicit Racists. You have the floor.
Assalamu alaikum, everyone. I hope everyone can hear me. Thank you, Zainab, so much for having me at this event and also for the really kind introduction. I'm super excited to be here. Oh, can you guys hear me better now?
I can hear you loud and clear.
Oh, okay, perfect. I just had someone in the chat say they couldn't hear me. But yeah, thanks for letting me know. And I'm super excited to hear what other presenters, speakers of the day have to say. This piece is titled An Open Letter to Complicit Racist. Dear bystander, how does it feel to breathe? How does it feel to float? Your steps are light. I am carrying generations on my shoulders. How does it feel to have translucent skin? I sink, you float, and you don't offer a hand. If I scream, I'm angry, Black woman. If I kneel quietly, I'm ungrateful. I've never been taught how to swim in an ocean full of sharks. There isn't a manual on how to be Black in America. I have everything to lose if I fight. My silence is due to survival. Yours is for comfort. I stand up for my rights to an officer. I risk my life I march in the streets. I risk my freedom. I complain in corporate America. I risk my paycheck. What do you risk other than comfort and privilege? Being Black is learning how to bend in for survival. Being Black woman is to breathe when no one is looking. I don't fear the lyncher nor the white hooded terrorist, but the bystander. I fear you, the one that records my death and watches it over and over and over, the one that uses our movement as a photo op, the one that comes to my family's funeral and yells, "All lives matter," the one that is outraged over property destruction rather than human protection. Lynchers are murderers, but who gave them the rope? Derek Chauvin played angel of death, but who gave him the badge? Who taught him how to steal? I'm not surprised when a murderer kills, but I am when bystanders are silent for 8 minutes and 46 seconds. I fear the Amy Coopers, the CEOs that stamp diversity and inclusion on their walls but don't rebuild the infrastructure. If a violent racist stabs me, at least I'll expect it. But what about the doctor who doesn't believe my illness? The banker who doesn't approve my loan? The journalist that searches my criminality before my humanity? I know what to expect when I see the KKK, but what about those that wash their hoods? Jim Crow would have just been a bill if he wasn't brought to life by bystanders. Lynch mobs haven't stopped, they've just become televised. To the bystanders, I don't need you to check in on me. Check your racist family, question your workplace culture, write a check, challenge your implicit bias, redistribute your privilege, relearn history, listen, and then listen more. Bystander silence is the language of the oppressor. Don't you think it's time to finally stand? Thank you so much again for having me.
Wow, mashallah, so powerful. Thank you so much, Bayadir, for joining us today and sharing that piece. We're so truly honored to have such a seasoned artist like you with us today and to share such consequential work. It really means a lot. Again, everyone, if you enjoyed that piece, then you will certainly enjoy her newly published book, Secondhand Smoke. It's available again for purchase at yourbayadir.com. When I'm finished speaking, I'll put it in the chat box and we'll also put it on Instagram, inshallah. Please keep an eye out for that. Please order it. Please support Bayadir. It's amazing. So if we're ready, inshallah, next I'd like to invite Sheikh Abdul Jalil to begin his lecture on the topic, if he is here. I'm not sure.
I saw him when the Quran recitation was happening.
Oh,
I was here. I remember seeing him. Well, I don't.
Yes, I think he's here.
Inshallah, he can get.
Assalamu
Alaikum
Assalam.
Can everybody hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين حبيبي وحبيبي إله العالمين أبي القاسم محمد اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين الذين ذاب الله عنهم الرجس وطهرهم تطهيرا اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. قال الله سبحانه وتعالى في محكم تنزيله بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم يا أيها الناس إنا خلقناكم من ذكر وأنثى وجعلناكم شعوبا وقبائل لتعارفوا إن أكرمكم عند الله أتقاكم صدق الله العلي العظيم. My dear brothers and sisters, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh. Allow me to thank all of you for all of this effort, and may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bless this effort and all this hard work, inshallah. Quickly, the question is, did Quran speaks about racism or not? A lot of time, people think that this is something that started way after the Prophet, and Quran doesn't touch about these matters. But we often say that Quran did not leave anything without explanation. Nothing. Because Quran itself speaks and says, "Ma farratna fil kitabi min shay." We have not left anything that is necessary, is important for mankind, and is not been explained. Never. And that is why on the day of Ghadir, when Quran says, "Al-yawma akmaltu," today I completed, which means everything that you need is in there. It's done. But now, Quran spoke about racism, discrimination. If you look at this verse that we just read in Surah Al-Hujurat, it is mentioned by the Mufassirin that the verse was revealed upon the Prophet because of racism that took place at the time of the Prophet. How did it come about? There are two tafsir that scholars mention, two sabab al-nuzul, two cause of why this verse was revealed. But some scholars believe that it was two different incidents. One incident happened and the eye was revealed, and another incident happened similar to the first one, then the same eye was revealed again to remind the people. The first one, it is said after the Prophet came to Mecca and conquered Mecca and took Mecca in charge. Then the Prophet asked Bilal al-Habashi to go on top of the Kaaba and call Adhan, which he did. While he was on top of the Kaaba calling Adhan, one companion was talking to another companion in the crowd. Imagine, these are the people who left their homes, come to Mecca to strive and fight and defend Islam. And he looked at one of the companions and said, "So the Prophet didn't see anyone among the Arabs to call Adhan except this black crow." That's exactly his word. لم يجد رسول الله أحدا للآذان إلا هذا الغراب الأسود. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was listening. Then the other person that he spoke to, he also made a statement. I said, "I'm glad my father was not alive to see this thing that is happening," which means Bilal coming to be the adhan of the Prophet, mu'adhin of the Prophet. Then Allah revealed this verse, telling Rasulullah to talk to all of them. Ya ayyuhan nas, O you human being, inna khalaqnakum min dhakarin. We have created you from a male and a female, which is Adam and Hawa. وَجَعَلْنَاكُمْ شُعُوبًا وَقَبَائِلَ. And from this Adam and Hawa, we made you to become a tribe and sub-tribes. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, "Inna akramakum indallahi atqakum." Indeed, the most honored one in the sight of Allah, the best of all of you, is whom? Is the one who fears Allah the most. So you see, even at the time of Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa alayhi, there were these issues. Not only time. Now, when I talk about Bilal, it's not just Bilal who faced the discrimination at the time of the Prophet. Even Salman al-Farisi, he had problems too. Salman al-Farisi, when he came to Mecca, Medina to accept Islam, any dispute between him and anyone, the first thing they says, "You, the son of the idol, the fire worship." That's how they describe him. Yabnal Abadat Nar. That's what they, and Rasulullah used to come in and say, why are you calling him this name? Innahu mu'min, he's a believer. Why are you referring him to the ancestors who he has nothing to do with? And why are you holding him for something that his ancestors did? And then the Prophet reminds them, wasn't your ancestors were idol worshippers too? Why didn't you say something about it? Now, this is how those minorities at the time of the Prophet were challenged with this kind of discrimination. But the most important thing that I want us to understand is how did the Prophet and Quran dealt with this issue? Because there are so many of them. Some of them was not mentioned in the Quran, was incident. Because another thing about Bilal al-Habashi, at the time of the Prophet knew very well that Bilal al-Habashi was not an Arab. He knew very well who is Bilal, and he knew all of the companions. But he chose Bilal al-Habashi to be mu'adhin. Do you know that some of the companions will come to Rasulullah and say, Ya Rasulullah, he cannot even say sheen. Bilal al-Habashi, when he says ashhadu, instead he says ashadu. That's wrong, Ya Rasulullah. The complaining comes after one after other. The Prophet came and said, look, inna sheena Bilal inda Allahi sheenan. That the scene that he said, that you hear seen, is considered sheen in the sight of them. They came so much to oppose Bilal al-Habashi, to stop calling adhan, but he didn't. And that is why when you look historically, after Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam died, Bilal al-Habashi could not stay in Medina. He has to move back to Syria and live there until Fatimah al-Zahra alayhi salam came into his dream. And she said to him, Ya Bilal, why? Why did you leave us? Why did you forget us after Rasulullah? Bilal al-Habashi, from the dream that he saw, he came back to Medina. And the day he came to Medina, it's like the day Rasulullah passed. People started crying because his coming back reminded them with Rasulullah. Reminded them those days where Rasulullah brought all the nations together. Because at the time of Rasulullah, they were every ethnicity that you can think of was among the Prophet's companions. For example, you have Suhaib al-Rumi. Rumi from the word Rome, European. He was there among the companions of the Prophet. Then you have also Salman al-Farisi, who was there among the companions. Then you have Bilal al-Habashi. Then you have other nations. They all around Rasulullah, and they all were treated as one nation. And that is how Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam dealt with his companions. Right? So when he came back, it reminded them, Fatimah al-Zahra alayhi salam, she asked Bilal al-Habashi to call adhan. And he did. And that adhan even brought more tears and more memories to the companions. Right? Now, because of lack of time, my dear brothers and sisters, how did Islam deal with this racism? How did the Prophet deal with it? Now, number one, as Quran talks, and how the Prophet also in Ahlul Bayt, is we have to deal with it as a one of the ignorance that we need to educate people. And that's what Rasulullah called it, al-jahiliyyah, ignorant, right? And people need to be educated. All right, that is how we have to deal with it. That's number one. And number two, to go back and see how did the Prophet look at people. People are people. Allah created us in Surah Al-Rum. Allah mentioned we created you different nations, different languages. Why? It's for a reason. What is the reason? To show the power and the ability of Allah. Not to look down upon one another because of one thing. So that is one of the lessons we have to learn, right? That your color of your skin or your ethnicity that you have is not going to make you better than somebody. What makes you better than somebody is what you are able to achieve as a person, not what your ancestors or your color or your language. These are all something else. You should be proud of what you have achieved. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in Islam teaches us all kind of equality in all aspects of Islam. you look in our prayer, when we stand to pray Salat al-Jama'ah, it's one of the teaching of equality. I hope and pray that inshallah we will learn the lesson of equality from these teachings of Quran and Islam, inshallah. I would like to stop here and pray for your efforts and for all this dedication. May Allah bless you. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh.
Ameen. Thank you so much for that very informative lecture, Sheikh. It's very helpful to learn about the importance of these social issues from an Islamic standpoint, so we sincerely appreciate the lessons that you've so clearly articulated to us today. Next up, we have Sister Niciah, who will share her presentation with all of us.
Inshallah, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Sheikh Jalil, it's lovely to see your face. I haven't seen you in a while. I haven't been home since coronavirus. Alhamdulillah. So what I kind of want to frame my presentation around is how we're defining racism, right? But before we get there, so someone asked in the chat box, what resources can we look at? Inshallah, we can come up with like a book list or like a curriculum that we can give to everyone, because a lot of study has to be done, a lot of reading, a lot of reprogramming and deprogramming, and we can't give out all the books today. But we'll put together a syllabus, inshallah. But when we're talking about moving from racist to non-racist to anti-racist, first we have to back up and say, well, what is racism, right? What does it even mean to be racist, right? We can't say, I want to be non-racist. Well, what is that? You know, what does that look like? And so there was a study, a focus group that was done recently, and a couple hundred white people and a couple hundred Black people were asked, what is racism? And there was a huge variation in the answer, where white and non-Black participants define racism as individual events or aggressions against individual people. So it's like, I'm a racist if I've done something as a person to someone else, right? If I've done something to someone because they're Black, then I'm racist. And that's what racism is, right? It's individual instances of violence or individual instances of oppression, things like that. Whereas Black people define racism as systems that work to oppress people. Those are vastly different definitions, right? And so the first definition fails, because you can easily say, well, I've never committed an act of violence against a Black person, so I'm not racist, right? That's not me. My family has never done X, Y, and Z. We're not racist, right? However, there are systems that work to enforce oppression of non-white people in a hierarchy. So the closer you are to whiteness, because there's a spectrum of whiteness, the closer you are, the more proximity you have to whiteness, the more you benefit from these systems. And the systems are educational systems, incarceration systems, medical systems, our language, the way we teach in elementary schools. There are systems, and that's what racism really is. It's not individual, individual incidences are important, but that's not what racism is, right? It's really a larger macrocosm of systems that have been designed to intentionally oppress, exclude, and commit violence against Black people and non-white people. And so that's what racism is. And so it's important for us to have a working definition that recognizes that when we're talking about racism, we're talking about systems. We're talking about whole languages. We're talking about whole medical fields. We're not talking about, did you personally do something against Black people? That's insufficient. And in the grand scheme of things, like, it matters in your individual life, but on a grand scale, not so much, And conversely, whether, you've avoided personally offending or acting against Black people, like, that's great, but you've done nothing to combat the systems. And that's where anti-racism comes in. So anti-racism is the ability to work actively against those systems. So not just to say, well, I've never done anything to a Black person. I've never attacked a Black person. I've never called anyone these names, right? That doesn't mean you're anti-racist. That means you maybe are not racist, maybe, possibly, because you can still be racist and not have committed acts of violence against Black people. You can still be racist. You can still be racist and have never used a racial slur, right? And so when we step back and we look at whole systems, then, only then, can we really think about how we can become anti-racist. And so that's the first thing. And so when we're thinking about racism, we also have to think about white supremacy, because racism exists within a history of white supremacy, right? There's no such thing as racism without white supremacy. And so in order to back up even further, we have to remember that whiteness is a concept, right? Whiteness is something that was invented over time. just like the concept of blackness was invented over time. Europeans weren't always referred to as white. At some point, they were just German, just Belgian, just Norwegian, just British, you know? And over time, there became a concept that said, wait, if you're white, if we can group you in this category, then you have certain rights that other people don't have. You have access to certain systems and institutions that other people don't have. So wait, let's create this group called white, and we'll put in British people and we'll put in Germans, right? But if you look, Irish people weren't even white. You know, it's relatively recent that Irish people were determined as white. Non-Black Latinos weren't always considered white. And so when you look at the history of how whiteness was created and why it was created, it's only then that you can say, okay, if I understand whiteness, then I understand white supremacy, and then I can understand racism as a larger institution, right? And so it's important to remember that, you know, I'm not saying that white people don't exist or Europeans don't exist, because people from Europe obviously exist. Europe obviously exists. But the concept that people from Europe are white, or people who are from certain places are Black, that's man-made. And that's not from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and we have to remember that, right? And so that's super important. And so the first step, if you look at the Sunnah and in prophetic ministry, the first step towards changing a people, creating an ummah, changing systems, is changing language, right? So before the Prophet, peace be upon him, asked people, you know what, y'all got to stop drinking alcohol. You know, y'all got to stop fornicating. The first thing was, let's change language. Let's change how we speak about each other. Let's change how we speak about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Let's change how we think. If we can do that first, then we can say, okay, you ready? Let's make sure y'all wearing hijabs. Let's make sure we're not drinking. Let's make sure we're marrying each other. Let's make sure we're freeing the slaves. But first, we have to change our language, because your language reflects how you think and how you understand the world, right? And so when we're talking about racism, we have to step back and understand our language, and so that we can understand how whiteness is used, how racism is used, and how white supremacy is used in our society, right? Then after that, we can begin to be active. And so I would say one of the questions that was posed for the speakers was, how do we become better allies, and how can we work towards anti-racism? That's the first thing. If we can understand the language that we use when we're thinking about race relations, when we're thinking about social justice and things like that, we have to be very intentional with the words we use and understand where they came from, right? And I said this in the first event that we had in this series, but what makes the Ahlul Bayt distinct is that we know history. That's why we're the Ahlul Bayt. That's why we're Shia, because we know the early history of Islam, right? And this is how we become distinct. And so for us, our challenge is always knowing the history. And so with racism, it's no different. You have to know the history of how these things became, because if you don't understand that, you can't really work against them. And there's no way you can be an ally without truly understanding how these systems came to be, understanding that they're systems, and understanding the history of them. And so that's super important. But the next thing is, you can't be an ally without examining your proximity to whiteness and how you benefit from whiteness. So me, for example, I'm a Black girl. I'm a light-skinned Black girl with features that are very considered beautiful according to European standards. So I have light skin privilege. I have to remember that. I have to walk in that. I have to check my light skin privilege, because that is a benefit that I have because of white supremacy. I'm closer physically to whiteness than my brothers and sisters. And so I benefit from that. I'm able to enter rooms that, you know, my darker skinned brothers and sisters can't enter, right? I am able to have access to resources that my darker skinned brothers and sisters don't have access to. And when we think about whiteness on a spectrum, and we think about honorary whiteness. So in America, whiteness is at the top of our racial hierarchy, and Blackness is at the very bottom. And in between there, you have Asians, you have non-Black Latinos, you know, you have people who are from Middle Eastern countries and from Arab countries. You have Black Latinos, you have Indigenous Americans, and then you have Black people, right? And so when we think about that, we have to think about what is my proximity to whiteness, and how do I benefit from white supremacy? And if we can't ask ourselves that and be very honest about that, then we can't be allies. There's no way I can consider you in the same fight as me if you can't step back and check how you benefit from white supremacy. And if you can't do that, then you won't begin to analyze the systems that you're complicit in, right? And so that's super important also. Like, if we can really step back and look at how we benefit from the concept of whiteness existing, because whiteness didn't always exist, and at some point we have to eradicate it. Again, not eradicating white people and not eradicating Europeans, but eradicating this concept that you're from these countries, so you are white and you have full citizenship because of your whiteness, and you have access to certain systems and institutions because of your whiteness, and the antithesis of that is blackness, right? At some point, as Muslims, we're going to have to move past that. If we want to build a new ummah and a new world order, we have to move past that, right? We have to move past whiteness and move past blackness. And those are man-made concepts. And they're not concepts made by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So that's how you know we have to get rid of them, right? And so that's super important. Another thing for us to think very critically about is how white supremacy functions out of love and an obsessive love for the dunya. White supremacy was created to give white people or Europeans access to capital, to land, to citizenship rights, to institutions that everybody else didn't have. And so it was a way to resource hoard. If you're white, if you're a white male, you can own land. Okay, so then you have to say, who's white? German, British, French, Portuguese. These are vastly different cultures. It's vastly different languages. These are from completely different spaces, right? But it was like an in club. If you can be considered part of this group, then you can have land. You can own human capital. You can own slaves. You can enter institutions of higher learning. You can become a doctor, right? That's what whiteness was created for, out of love for the dunya, because that thinking was, if we can exclude other people from owning land, from having capital, from entering higher education, then we can hold on to it because we love it. So we think about what the enemies of our spiritual ascension are. The dunya is one of the four, right? And so that love for dunya is what white supremacy is. And so as Muslims, we have to step back and say, what is my relationship to white supremacy? How do I benefit from this? What is my relationship to racialized capitalism? Because capitalism came out of white supremacy. Capitalism is a system by which you say some people own capital and some people don't. If you own capital, you're an employer. If you don't own capital, you're an employee. And if we look at who owns capital in the United States, who owns the land, who owns the factories and the means of production, right? Who owns the intergenerational wealth? That is from white supremacy. It's from that love of the dunya that says, I'm gonna hoard resources and y'all can't have it. And even if you're not a slave anymore, fine, okay, fine. You can't be a slave no more, but you're gonna come to this institution. You're not gonna buy no land, not in my neighborhood, because I love the dunya. I wanna hold on to it. And I wanna exclude you from that. And so I just want to implore us to think about that when we think about whiteness, when we think about how we benefit from racialized capitalism, when we think about how we benefit from racialized mass incarceration, from how we have racialized institutions of higher learning, the medical system. These are the things that we have to be thinking about systemically in order to figure out how we can sever ourselves from this love of the dunya that makes us exclude other people from having access to full citizenship and capital. And land, and really, you know, the best of this world therein. And so that's super important also, just knowing that white supremacy and racialized, all of the systems that we have are really, they just come from a love of the dunya. And we know that loving the dunya and being attached to the materials of this world, I mean, you're going straight to hell in a handbasket, right? And we know this. Right? And so we have to constantly be asking ourselves, how am I benefiting from these systems, and how am I working actively to eradicate them? What am I doing to make sure that we all have equal access to land ownership, right? Because we know we don't own it, we're stewards. That's another capitalistic thing, right? The idea that you can own land, that's not Islamic, right? That you can own land and exclude other people from living where you live. Someone made that up. And they made it up at the same time that they were making up white supremacy and making up whiteness and making up blackness, because blackness didn't used to exist, right? So all these things are man-made concepts, and we have to think about what the motivation is so that we can eradicate the systems and then eradicate the concepts. Because until we do that, we're not anti-racist. At best, you're non-racist, at best. And that's a stretch, because in most cases, if you're not working to eradicate the systems, it's because you're benefiting from them. And that's hard work, and that's difficult questions to ask, you know. And it's hard to look back at your family lineage and say, you know, I've benefited from these systems. How can I make sure that I'm being a good steward of the resources around me and paying back, you know, and correcting those wrongs and joining the good and forbidding the evil. And in order to enjoin the good and forbid the evil, we have to actively eradicate those systems. It's not good enough to say, well, I've never called anybody a racial slur, or I've never shot a Black person or something, you know? But have you ever benefited from white supremacy? And if so, what are you doing to correct that? And that's it. That's my story. I'm sticking to it.
Wow, 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 wow. Thank you so much, Sister Niciah. That was incredible with the eloquent and very informative presentation. And we want to thank you for being so willing to teach consecutively at our teaching events. And I'm so excited for the next one to hear from you more, inshallah. They really would not be possible without your guidance and wisdom. So thank you so much from the bottom of our hearts. Before transitioning into the Q&A segment, I just want to thank all of our speakers again for taking the time to educate us. We sincerely appreciate the time, effort, and energy it takes to educate our community and to shift us into a better, more inclusive and anti-racist society. At this time, inshallah, the speakers will answer the questions that were submitted in the chat box. Inshallah, they will hopefully be able to address all of the questions that have been submitted throughout the event. But if not, we are planning a part 3 to the teaching series, and hopefully you can get your questions answered then. Please feel free to continue sending in your questions, and Reza will kindly ask them, read them off on your behalf. So I think we can get started with that. And please feel free to continue sending in questions during the Q&A segment.
Thank you, Sister Zainab, and thank you to both of our speakers. You know, with your eloquence and your information, alhamdulillah, I think we're making progress towards our eventual goal. So the first question that we have here, and I'll let Sheikh Abdul answer or take a stab at this one, and then Sister Niciah. Question is, how do we deal with racism from families when it comes to marriage or interracial marriage acceptance?
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. The answer is, see, for me, we always should look at how did the Prophet dealt with the issue. Because the Prophet is the best example for all of us. And Quran says, لَقَدْ كَانَ لَكُمْ فِي رَسُولِ اللَّهِ أُسْوَةٌ حَسَنَةٌ. That indeed, the Prophet is the best role model for all of you. You know, at the time of the Prophet, there was a time that Bilal al-Habashi was sitting with the Prophet. Then the Prophet asked him, Ya Bilal, why don't you get married? Then Bilal said, because I haven't got any woman that is ready to marry. Then the Prophet said to him, Ya Bilal, go. Any house that you find, knock that house and ask them if they have a wife. Tell them that Rasulullah sent you to come and get me. Bilal al-Habashi went to the first house. They don't have any daughters. The second house, no daughters. The third house, there's a daughter, but she was too young. The next one, he has older daughters who are ready for marriage. Bilal al-Habashi entered and said, I'm here to get married. The father said to Bilal, I'm not ready to marry my daughter to you. While this conversation was going on, one of the daughters was listening. The conversation between Bilal and the father. The daughter came in and she said, my father, he said, the father said, yes. He said he wants to get married. The daughter said, no, you did not. That's not what he said. Did you really heard what he said? He said, yes. He said he wants to. He said, no. She said, the Prophet sent me. I said, that's the point that you're missing. It didn't come here on his own. It says, the Prophet told me to come and ask. Why are you turning him away? He's a messenger of the Prophet. You willing to marry Bilal al-Habashi? She said, yes, I'm willing to marry Bilal al-Habashi. because the Prophet sent you. The father could not believe what he was listening from his own daughter, right? So sometimes we as a children, we have to make the difference, right? Because in Islam, color, the ethnicity is not what the Islam told us to look for marriage. When they asked Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, who should be a one that a woman should look for, the Prophet put out there, إِذَا خَطَبَكُم مَّن تَرْضَوْنَ دِينَهُ وَخُلُقَهُ فَزَوِّجُوهُ. Whoever comes that you trust their religion, their practicing, a believer, وَخُلُقَ, and their akhlaq, their mannerism, right? The Prophet said, فَزَوِّجُوهُ. Have him marry your daughter. So it's not about, oh, he has to be Pakistani. If it's not Pakistan, even if it's Pakistani, he has to come from this city. Even if he's from that city, he has to speak this language. If he doesn't, then he's not qualified. There's no such thing. So to say the answer is we all have to play our role as in the family. Whether I'm a child, I'm a parent, I'm a cousin, if these sort of things comes, we all have to take a stand and make sure that we correct it. كلكم راع وكلكم مسؤول. We all are responsible for any wrongdoing that comes in our way. We have to stand against it and address it as it is.
Thank you very much. Sister Niciah, do you have anything to add, or should we move on to the next question?
Yeah, I'm gonna keep it brief though. First of all, let us remember that Hajar, may Allah reward her for her efforts as a black girl. Okay. And had it not been for her union and the creation of her son, we would not have Islam and the lineage that brought us Islam. You know, we would have Islam because nothing would have stopped it. But the lineage that brought us Islam, we wouldn't have that without a union between a non-black person and a black person. Right? Very important. And there's Islamic precedent that beautiful things come from those unions. But to modern day, right? So for those of us who are millennials here, even the non-millennials, a lot of us are reprogramming and changing things in a lot of ways. We out here eating vegan. We're trying to get rid of plastic. We're trying to get rid of the prisons, a lot of new thinking. And sometimes there creates a cognitive dissonance between us and our parents and our elders who are like, what? You ain't feeding that child no meat? What? You ain't gonna drink no milk? What do you mean you ain't gonna use plastic? What do you mean get rid of prisons, right? And so what we have to fill that space of misunderstanding with is compassion and love. So sometimes we lead with examples, but we don't educate with our mouths, right? Sometimes you have to preach with your walk, and if necessary, at the very last step, use your words. But sometimes it's your walk and the compassion that says you're not here yet, and maybe you don't understand, but I'm gonna love you in the meantime, and I'm gonna show you better. I'm gonna show you. It took a long time for my family to understand why I don't microwave my kids' food. And a lot of patience and compassion for me that said, okay, well, it was okay for you. And yes, I made it off, microwave foods and Capri Suns. You're right, I made it. But in the meantime, I'm gonna be compassionate because I know something that you don't know. And it may take you a while to do the work of reforming your identity. Sometimes the things we learn get wrapped up in our identity and becomes who we are. So we're asking people to unlearn things like that. We're asking you to change who you are at your core. That's scary. That's scary. And so with that, we got to move gracefully and move in compassion. It says, I'm gonna ask you to change a whole bunch about yourself, and that's okay. I can be patient in the meantime, but I'm gonna walk better, and to walk boldly and to not let the fears and the misunderstandings and the poor programming, because a lot of this is just programming, the poor social programming that our elders have, stop us from the things that we know to be true. Sometimes your mama gonna be a hater, and it's just that, but if you know something, Ibrahim, peace be upon him, his folks was worshiping idols. And he said, I know better. I know there's one God. And my folks might be haters, and that's okay, because I know there's one God, right? Think about the Quraysh. Sometimes your folks don't know any better. You have to walk boldly in what you know to be true. And that's on that.
Thank you very much. That very eloquently said. Next question we had was submitted anonymously, and it's a little long, so I'm going to summarize as best as I can in the interest of time. The individual is saying that there's a member of my Muslim friend group that is openly okay with being racist and identifies as anti-Black, and he's not ashamed of it. He's proud of it, right? The question is, Islamically, it's not recommended to cut people out of your life, right? And completely cut ties with people. but this person is perpetuating the issue and negatively impacts the culture of the group. At what point does this person either, remove themselves from the group because the group is not willing to remove this individual, or say, I'm going to cut this individual out of my life because they're promoting this negative, perspective? Because Islamically, we want to have compassion. We want to, keep the ties of community and friendship and bonds, but this person is doing something anti-Islamic to this person's perspective. So at what point is it Islamically okay to eliminate this person from your social circle?
So Islam tells us very clearly that we're not supposed to sever ties in our family. Islam does not tell us not to sever ties with people who actively oppose Islam. So if we know something is Islamic, or not un-Islamic, anti-Islamic, and they're propagating that, the entryway to the heart is through the ears. That's why we're told to watch our mouths. When we're angry, you have to watch our mouths, because things that go through your ears go straight to your heart. And so if someone is saying something to you that's not Islamic, you have to protect yourself from that. If you look at the treatise of rights, the rights of our ears is to only hear things that are beautiful and that are righteous and are divine. So if you have someone who's saying those things to you, it's like if you had someone who promoted sex work and they were always saying those things to you, or someone who's like, yeah, I'm a stripper and I do extra, you wouldn't keep being their friend, right? This is that anti-Islamic, that if someone were promoting adultery, would you keep listening to that and be their friend? And so at some point, we can do as much educating as we can, but you have to know when to guard yourself, when to guard your space, when to guard your heart, your ears. Your ears have rights, your eyes have rights, right? So you have to know the thing that after a while, listening to these things are detrimental, and we become who we're friends with. We know that, and we have the right to have good company. And it's the sunnah. If you think about the companions of the prophet, it's the sunnah. You'll keep, would the prophet have been their friend and listen to these things? That's my question. And
Thank
so
you.
the passion is important, but like Sis said, birds of a feather flock together, and so at some point you're complicit in that. If you're telling someone it's at a certain point, you're saying it's okay, I'll still be your friend. But we know we have to cut ties off, and we're not supposed to cut our ties off with our family if it's possible, right? But if that's not a blood relation, which it doesn't sound like it is, I didn't read the question, it was long, it might have been a blood relation, but if it's not a blood relation, I don't think there's any precedent that says you have to maintain a friendship with that person who is outwardly anti-Islamic. Like, once we frame racism and anti-Blackness as anti-Islamic, as shaitanic. The shaitan was the first example, and Dr. Sherman Jackson has done a lot of work on this. The shaitan is the first example that we see a being saying, oh, you're made of something that's different. You look different. I can't, I'm not bowing down to you. I'm not respecting you. That's shaitanic. And so when we're enjoining the good, that includes our friendships and our relationships. MashaAllah.
Inshallah. Thank you very much. Sheikh Abdul, I want to give you a moment if you would like to add anything else to that question.
Yes. When a person is having this kind of behavior, there is a responsibility of doing what we call Amr bil Ma'ruf and Nahy anil Munkar. If that works, the relationship continues. If that didn't work, and at some point you find out the person is having a negative impact on you, then Islam said at that point you have to distance yourself. But you cannot cut a relationship completely. You have to keep the relationship where at least you can say salam, because there is something called haqq al-Muslim ala al-Muslim, the right of a Muslim upon another Muslim, right? Which the Prophet says there are almost like 30 of them, right? So one of them is you can cut the tie with them. So you can keep at least to the minimum, which is like when the person have a good, like a birth or marriage, you can go and give him the well wishes. If they lost someone, you call and give them, but there is no kind of like closest relationship. At least to that distance, you have to keep it as a Muslim. Yes.
Thank you very much, Sheikh Abdul. I appreciate that. Sister Niciah, Master, I'm giving you salams and walk away. I guess it's as simple as that. do the wajib response to the salam and proceed on. And in the interest of time, I do want to, wrap up in the next, few minutes, but I'd like to touch base on a few of the other questions submitted. We have a question, I think this is directed to Sister Niciah. The question is, as immigrants, they have faced various forms of discrimination, but never the systematic dehumanization that Black people has faced in this country. To argue that racism, including more than 2 centuries of Black enslavement, can be overcome by hard work and strong values, it's hurtful. Do you have any suggestions on how to dismantle the model minority myth without negating their personal experiences?
Absolutely. So I think the model minority myth is the example where we say the exception proves the rule, right? So Barack Obama, for example, model minority, right? It proves the rule because he's the only one, right? And the same thing with mass incarceration, right? We know mass incarceration is racialized, but sometimes white people get caught up in the mass incarceration, and that proves the rule that there's such the minority, right? And so again, I think what would be helpful when we're thinking about this myth and how to debunk this myth is to think about how we benefit from white supremacy and our proximity to whiteness, because often the minority groups that become the model minorities have closer proximity to whiteness. And there's been an intentional effort in America to create a chasm between non-Black immigrants and Black immigrants, and between American-born Black people and non-American-born Black people, that says, oh, you're an immigrant, watch out for those Black people, they lazy, you don't want to get caught up with them, right? They're lazy, they're criminals. And so a lot of times immigrants come in and they receive that programming immediately. And I've heard plenty of anecdotes of immigrants who have come over and had no anti-Blackness before they come here. And then when they come, it's like, watch out for those neighborhoods, watch out for those criminals, watch out for those thugs, right? And those things become internalized, even without us knowing it. And so, again, just understanding the systems that allow certain groups, even minority groups, to have upward mobility and not other groups historically is super important, because there are forms of citizenship and rights that a lot of minority immigrants receive upon coming to America that Black people are still denied. And that's important, but you only know that if you know how citizenship works in this country, if you know how voter suppression works in this country, if you know how constitutional rights are denied to some groups and other groups in this country, right? You have to know the systems and know that they're designed intentionally, new SAT word, that they're designed intentionally to keep the bottom of the racial hierarchy, which is American-born Black people, at the bottom. And so, of course, other minority groups are able to move and have upward mobility, because it's that goes to fuel the narrative. Like, look, you're a minority, you're doing it, they can't do it, it's something wrong with them, right? And so at a certain point, you become part of it. You become a pawn in the puzzle, because you're like, oh, you pulled yourself up by their bootstraps, why can't they? It's them, and that's not it. But you're being used in that to create and perpetuate that narrative. And so again, it's just important to know the systems and what is at play to allow that model minority thing to take place.
I appreciate that. Thank you very much. Another question we have is, what are examples of microaggressions that perpetuate the issue of racism? What are things that I can be able to identify, that I should be looking at within myself, that I may be doing that is perpetuating this issue?
I think one of the things we have to do is be very careful with the term microaggression, because microaggression makes it seem like it's something minimal, and a lot of the things are very emotionally and mentally violent towards Black people. So for instance, the sister was performing her piece earlier, and she talked about the narrative that we have of angry Black women, right? And so often when Black women speak up, whether it's in the workplace, whether it's in our marriages, whether it's in the masjid, that narrative is thrown at us like, oh, she a mad Black girl, right? That's gaslighting. That's mentally and emotionally abusive. But then we call it a microaggression. We're like, oh, it's just a microaggression. I just said, oh, look, it's angry Keisha. At a coworker very recently not a coworker, a colleague recently. She works in corporate America, a very white space. And she asked, could her supervisors make space for them to talk about what's happening in America? She's like, I feel like it's an elephant in the room. We're coming to work, riots are happening, all sorts of things are happening. And we're like tiptoeing around it. And it would make me feel safe at work if we could have space to talk about it. And one of her coworkers responded and said, that's angry Keisha. We love to see fired up Keisha. And it's like, whoa, that was abusive that's violent. And when we call it a microaggression, it makes it seem like, oh, it's just a microaggression, you can move around. That's violent. Those are acts of violence. And so we have to kind of reframe that. Some examples are, again, the narratives that we perpetuate, the language that we use. Passive racism would be a better term. But yeah, microaggressions, they can be very sinister and they can be more violent because you live a life of microaggressions, passive racism that can take so much more of an emotional and mental toll than physical violence in so many ways, right? So again, I think how can we check that in ourselves, right? When we have that passive racism or implicit bias, that's what a lot of this is, implicit bias, is to check and see what are the narratives that you're carrying around about Black people. Right? To step back and ask yourself, why is it that you think X, Y, and Z happens in Black communities? We have to do this within the Black community too. A lot of times people point to Black on Black crime. And it's like, you want the police to stop killing you? But you're killing each other. Okay. That's a narrative that we have and a program and a story that we're running in our minds. And so when we step back and say, well, why do we think it is that we talk about Black on Black crime? Where does the crime come from? Does it come from lack of resources? Does it come from collective trauma that was never treated? You take people from being chattel slaves, from being property, and you send them out in the world, and there was no mass intervention to say, where your head at? Are you okay? How you feeling? How you feel about yourself? Do you have any trauma from that? And no one stops and interrogates these stories that we carry around. And so that's a huge part of where the microaggressions come from. That angry Black woman stereotype, the mammy stereotype, the Jezebel, the way we sexualize Black women. A lot of those things are considered microaggressions, but we have to step back and say, where do they come from? And that will allow us to reprogram, well, deprogram first of all, and then reprogram towards saying those narratives are false, they're made up, and they exist to perpetuate white supremacy.
Right. Thank you very much. Sheikh Abdul, kind of building on that, are there elements within our communities that you can identify for us that we should use to evaluate ourselves, right? One thing that comes to mind is, I know sometimes when we're having iftar during Ramadan, right? People, start to group together, right? One thing we can do to say, hey, we're all on the same level is let's sit with someone who I don't know, who might not look like me within our community, or being as equally inviting, right? Someone walks into the masjid, I invite them, right? I don't shy away from them. I don't, I embrace them with open arms, and making that as part of our community culture. Are there other elements, Sheikh, that you can identify for us within our community that we can use as a template for evaluating ourselves in our own actions?
You mean evaluate ourselves in terms of what?
So within our communities, right? Within our Islamic communities, what are things that we should be looking out for to use as a model for changing ourselves?
Number one, regarding first of all, every one of us have to know that no matter how good I am, there is always room for improvement. If that is the first step, because sometimes the problem we have, we think, oh, I know it all, I got it all, I don't need any help. That is the beginning of the disaster. So if we all have this mentality, I'm not perfect, I have rooms to improve myself, that's one. Number two, once we get this mindset of there is always room for me to improve in all aspects of life, right? The next thing is, when I see somebody in a mosque or anywhere else, I have to treat them like Imam Zain al-Abidin said. And I think this can be a big and a very practical protocol for all of us. When you see anybody that you see, regardless of their color, their race, or whatever the case might be, when you look at them, there are always three things you can see in any person. Either they are older than you, or the same age, or younger than you. Imam Zain al-Abidin says, look at the person, if he's older than you, look at them and say, he is older than me, she is older than me. That means they have started worshiping Allah before I am. So they're much closer to Allah than I am. If they're the same age with you, oh, we are the same age, yes. But I know my sin, I don't know his sin, I don't know her sin. She might be better than me, because I know I have sins, but I don't know her sins. If they are younger, look at them and say, they are younger. I've been in this world before them, which means they might have committed less sin than I am. Protocol, looking at every individual. I don't think you will even think about, oh, I'm better than him or a scholar. If you look at these protocols that Imam Daniel gives us in our centers, if these can be
About anybody.
Sheikh, I think you got muted. There we go.
yes, yes, yes. I'm saying that is the protocol that I think if we can do it, we can improve ourselves on daily basis. As we see people come to our center or people we meet anywhere, if we have this, we can always look at people in these ways, and we will not even have any way to disrespect them or look down upon them, and also it will help us to also improve ourselves and our community as well.
Thank you so much, Sheikh Abdul. I appreciate it. I think that's, that was very comprehensive. You gave us a direct roadmap, right? A practical method for changing that perspective and that viewpoint upon others and life within your community. It's a very easy, 1, 2, 3 method that you can look at. I know we're coming up on time, so I want to send it back to Sister Zainab to close us out. But thank you all for your questions. I know we weren't able to address all of them in this discussion, but inshallah, we will. Inshallah, we'll be able to address them in part 3 and continue this conversation online. If you're interested in collaborating, and Sister Niciah, I see you want to make another comment. If you're interested in collaborating and continuing discussion with us and working to curate, more effective programming, please let us know. We're open to teamwork and more members providing their input and hopefully creating stronger content and programming. Sister Niciah.
Today, I see your question about incarceration and the justice system. It was very important. I just took a picture of it on my phone. So I'm going to, inshallah, try to work some conversation about how do we abolish systems while, building the bike while we ride it, right? Like if we want to abolish prisons, how do we seek justice for people who we think should be in prison? If we want to abolish capitalism, how do we make money through capitalism in the meantime, right? So we'll hold some space for that next time, inshallah.
Inshallah, thank you so much, Sister Niciah, for addressing that. I want to thank the speakers for fostering such a fruitful discussion and teaching us so much. I pray that we can follow all of the critical lessons that we learned today with action, inshallah. To the attendees, thank you all so much for joining. Please keep an eye out for part 3 of our teaching series. Inshallah, we can address some of the questions that went unresolved in this session. One important point, if you have any feedback for us, please DM us on Instagram or email us at mohebban-coordinators@gmail.com. Our new management team is really trying to improve ourselves every day with every new event. So please feel free to share your constructive feedback with us, inshallah, and we'll really try to work on it. So thank you all so much for attending. May Allah bless you all. Assalamu alaikum.
Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum.
Thank you all for attending. Inshallah, we'll see you very soon.